I'll call this VS Live Keynote. See if that's available here. Provide a password. Try to type that in right. I can pick the size of the VM. In this case, I'll just go with 1 core, a small VM. Provide a DNS name so I can access the VM. And then pick my region that I want to run. So again, the concept of regions being surfaced here for how I want to go and run my compute service. In this case, I'll run in West US. And then I can define an availability set. Availability set basically allows me to specify that within the data center, I want some of my resources, my virtual machine, my storage account, to be co-located within that data center to improve efficiency. So I've started creating a virtual machine here. It'll take around 10 minutes for that VM to start up. And once that VM started up, I can actually start drilling into it and view some more details. For the sake of time here, I went ahead and provisioned a virtual machine right before this keynote called VS Live VM. If I drill into the VM, you'll notice from the dashboard view here, I can get some basic monitoring statistics, such as the CPU usage, the disk I/O, and the network I/O. I can drill down and see that there's a number of disks attached, in this case 1 right now, to the VM. I can see my DNS entry, and I can further drill into this VM. What I want to do from here is actually just connect into it. And so by pressing connect, what I'll have the opportunity to do is download an RDP file that I can go ahead and just use the credentials that I specified during provisioning and log straight into that virtual machine. So I'm literally from my laptop right now on stage, connected into a virtual machine running within Windows Azure. Within this VM, you can see I'm on the server management dashboard. I could turn on various roles and features. I can go in Windows Explorer. I can copy files in. Because the VM is durable, all those changes I make will also be persisted. So for example, I can pull up Disk Manager here, and you can see by default there's a couple drives. So I can just go ahead and make some of those changes and customize this for my application. What I also want to show you is the ability to attach additional storage. So you notice this disk support here, where I have one OS disk right now. What I want to do is attach another disk. So you can attach a disk that's anywhere from 1 gig up to almost a terabyte of storage. So let me go ahead and add in another drive here, just under a terabyte. And you'll see here that we're actually going to provision that disk. We create these disks within our Windows Azure storage environment, and we're going to attach that disk straight to our Windows Azure virtual machine. So I'll take just a few seconds here for that to finish provisioning. While it's provisioning, let me go ahead and browse over to endpoints. From endpoints here, you can see that I have one endpoint configured for remote desktop. From endpoints, I can also turn on additional endpoints or open up additional ports. So for example, if this was a SQL-based VM, I might want to open up the common port of 1433 so I can connect into SQL Server that's running within this virtual machine. If I go over to the Configure tab, what you'll notice is once my configuration is done for adding additional disk, I'd be able to also change my virtual machine size and specify the availability set as well. So it's taking a few minutes to provision that. Looks like it's done now. If I go back over to the VM, we should see here, if I just do a refresh, I should see that drive attached. Doesn't look like it's attached yet. Take just a second here. Okay, it looks like it's there. Okay, it'll just take a few seconds for that drive to be attached. Once that drive's attached, then I'll be able to initialize that disk, format that disk, and start copying my content within that VM and within that disk. So you've seen in just a few minutes here how we can get started with Windows Azure virtual machines and spin up virtual machines where we can go run our own applications as part of that infrastructure. Let me go ahead and switch back over here to the presentation. We'll talk about some of the additional services exposed for Windows Azure. Before I do that, I want to drill in a little bit more into how those virtual machines function. One of the key things to understand about VMs is how we're managing those disks within the environment. Today, we utilize a format that's called VHD to provide the support for storing not only your data, but also the OS image. I imagine many of you are familiar with the VHD format already. It's a format that's used by Windows Server. It's even used by Windows 8 if you're running Hyper-V on Windows 8. What the VHD allows us to provide those, part of Azure, is just an extreme amount of portability for those virtual machine images. Let me give you an example. I can actually create virtual machine images within Windows Server and Hyper-V today that are maybe my Windows-based virtual machines, have my entire application and infrastructure already pre-provisioned, and I upload those virtual machines straight up to Windows Azure. Likewise, I can pull down the VMs that I've provisioned up in Azure and pull those down and run them in my own environment. Just gives me a lot of flexibility for being able to migrate and move from one environment to another as I need to throughout my application lifecycle. What this also provides, though, is the flexibility to go leverage additional service providers. So maybe should the application needs that I have change or the business needs change, I might want to actually take that virtual machine image, take it out as a VHD, and move to another service provider where I can spin up that virtual machine environment as well. And so that's all provided through the VHD format, which we've released as an open specification as well. So it's one of the key concepts to understand around virtual machines. So you've seen how we can get access directly to the infrastructure. But I imagine many of you in this room are building web-based applications, building websites, building web APIs. Probably many of you in this room have been using ASP.NET for quite some time. What we've provided with Windows Azure is also a service called Windows Azure Websites, which is a managed service that abstracts you from a lot of the configuration of the hardware, the infrastructure, and the networking. Allows you really just focus on building the application that you want to. I mentioned ASP.NET, and in addition to ASP.NET support, we've also exposed support for a number of other languages and frameworks. Node.js, PHP, and with an update we released just a few months ago, Python support as well. With Windows Azure Websites, also provide a lot of flexibility in how you deploy your applications. You can utilize Visual Studio and web deploy support, FTP, and just simply copy your web content up to Windows Azure Websites, or even use Git as a protocol for deployment. We integrate with a number of different source control solutions as well. So if I want to use the Team Foundation service on the cloud, or I have my code that's I'm doing collaborative and developing on GitHub or Codeplex, those are all options as well. With an Azure update we released just last week, we also introduced support for Dropbox. And so you can very simply sync through Dropbox all of your website content. And so this provides just an extreme amount of flexibility for going, deploying, and running web-based applications. You can get started with Windows Azure Websites for free. In fact, we provide the ability for you to go run 10 free websites on an ongoing basis. And then as your website needs to scale, you have more demands on the usage, then you can go in through a simple slider in the portal, scale up that to either a reserved mode or into a shared mode. So with that, why don't we go ahead and take a look at Windows Azure Websites. Let me switch over here to my demo machine. Hold on just a second here. Switch over here to my demo machine. And on my demo machine, what I'm going to do is take advantage of Windows Azure Websites. To do that, I'm going to introduce here a little application I've created. It's a simple ASP.NET MVC app. It's called Cloud Survey. If I run this application, what you'll notice is that we've built this application with the latest version of ASP.NET MVC and taken advantage of some of the key capabilities that have been exposed through ASP.NET. So, for instance, if I run this application, you'll notice we're taking advantage of the new support in ASP.NET MVC 4.5 for multiple authentication providers. So here I can log in here with Twitter, and so I'll just go ahead and log in with my Twitter account. If I can type that in right. Okay. And from here, you can see I can go and manage some of the surveys I've defined. I have a simple survey here called Keynote with a few questions that have been specified. I can open that up in a new window here. Just respond to that survey. So do I plan to use VMs? What's my favorite Windows Azure service? So a simple kind of app. In fact, one of the things we've taken advantage of in this application, though, is new support we just released in ASP.NET called SignalR. In fact, if I go ahead and respond to that survey again here and specify that, in this case, I want to use my favorite services, mobile services. Go ahead and submit that survey. And you can notice the list of the services that are instantly updated there on the left-hand side. So we're taking advantage of a new capability in ASP.NET called SignalR. Allows us to build these more real-time web-based applications. So similar kind of a modern web-based experience that I'm sure many of you in this room are starting to build today. So I built this application. I've run this application locally. I'm doing it in Visual Studio 2012. Now what I want to do is actually take this application to Windows Azure. To do that, I'm going to use Windows Azure websites. If I go back over to the Azure Management Portal, here you can see on the Windows Azure Websites view, I have a couple different websites I've already configured. In this case, let me go ahead and create a new website. And you'll notice there's a few different options. I can do a quick create, like what we saw with virtual machines, a custom create, or I can create from the gallery. If I specify the gallery, you'll notice that there's a number of different open source frameworks that are available that I can take advantage of here. So I can go and use .NET Nuke, I can use Umbraco, I can use even WordPress and run PHP with MySQL on top of Windows Azure websites if I want to spin up a very quick WordPress-based web application. A few weeks ago, we also introduced support for templates. And so if I want to get started with a very simple template-based ASP.NET site, Node.js, or even PHP site, that's a starting path as well. In this case, since I already have my website, a website that's using a SQL-based database, what I want to do is actually specify the option to do a custom create. We'll go ahead and give this a name like VS Live Keynote. Looks like it's available. Pick my region I want to run my application. Specify I want to create a new SQL database. And you'll notice then, as part of creating the website, I can actually define this server environment I want to use for SQL. I have one that's already provisioned for West US. And I'll go ahead and provide my credentials. Okay. And so within just a few seconds here, I've been able to provide the information, DNS information, provide all the information I need for provisioning a new Windows Azure website. So now Windows Azure is going off and creating that website for me. It's creating that SQL database for me. And you'll see in just a few seconds the provisioning is complete. From here, I'll just drill into VS Live Keynote. And you'll notice I have just a similar navigation experience to what you saw with virtual machines. I can drill into the dashboard, see some usage for my website. In this case, I'm running in free mode, so it shows my usage based on my quota for the day. I can also then just navigate out to that website. I can get access to the FTP endpoint and actually deploy some of my code. I can also set up deployment from source control providers. So TFS, Codeplex, GitHub, and including the new support for Dropbox we just released. In this case, what I'm going to do is actually use Visual Studio and the built-in support for web deploy to deploy my application. Let me go ahead and download a publishing profile, and I'll just save that into my downloads directory. If I simply go back to Visual Studio here, I'm just going to right-click and say Publish. What you'll see in Visual Studio 2012 is just integrated support for web deploy. If you happen to be running Visual Studio 2010, you can also install the web deploy support and get some of the same capability as part of Visual Studio 2010. If I just hit Import here, I can actually browse out to my publishing profile that I just downloaded. And once Visual Studio pulls that in, it already has all the credentials, the endpoint for doing the deployment. In fact, it'll also map in the connection information that's needed for my SQL database.